So sebaceous glands produce an oily substance called sebum. They're found everywhere throughout the body except your palms and soles, and they typically release their products via holocrine secretion. We talked about holocrine secretion. This is where the entire cell is ruptured or lysed to release that sebum. It's often associated with a hair follicle. So typically the sebum will be secreted onto the hair follicle, and then it will slide its way all the way down to the end of the hair follicle and then be deposited onto the skin. So for example, that's the way your hair, that's the way the body naturally moisturizes the hair and the skin. So sebum is essentially the body's own natural moisturizer. Right? It also functions to collect dirt. Right, so that dirt can slide down the hair shaft wrapped up in that oily sebum, as well as soften and lubricate the surface of the hair and the skin. So that's your sebaceous gland, and that produces your sebum. Sebum is often associated with acne as well, right? So lots of sebum production, which happens around puberty, can trigger acne, right? The clogging of those glands and those pores. Sweat glands. So sweat glands are often called sudoriferous glands. They're found all over the body in two different regions we'll talk about. They produce sweat, and sweat is a filtrate of blood. So it's basically a part of the plasma. If you took blood and you removed all the important stuff like the red blood cells, white blood cells, you removed some of the salts, mostly that watery component that was left back was what we have as sweat. It contains some waste, so small amount of urea, as well as some salts, so sodium, some chloride. That's why it has that salty taste if you've ever happened to taste sweat. There are two types of sweat glands. There are eccrine sweat glands. They release their secretions via merocrine secretion. Does anyone remember what merocrine secretion is? Merocrine secretion. This is where we had just exocytosis, right? This is the example that I gave for the goblet cell or the salivary gland. So the cell remained intact, and all we had was the release of those vesicles which contain whatever secretion. So that's your eccrine gland. It's typically found throughout the body, except in the areas of the groin and the axilla and the anus. Okay, it produces the most sweat, so it's the most numerous gland throughout the body, and this is what we call true sweat. All right, so it's salty. It doesn't really have any other identifiable components, so it's just water and salt. The next type of sweat gland is the apocrine gland, and this is confined to areas of the groin region, the armpit region, and then the genitals or the anal region as well. This produces a musky kind of sweat, which is unique to each individual, and it does have some components which are thought to help a person attract possible mates. So the idea here, or the theory, is that there are certain components in your sweat, in your apocrine gland sweat, or your body odor sweat, that can help you identify a possible mate. There are indicators about your immune system, indicators about your intelligence even, that can be found in your body odor, right? And then finally, the ceruminous glands and the mammary glands are examples of modified apocrine glands, and they basically are found in the air. So the ceruminous glands secrete airwax, whereas the mammary glands secrete milk, right? They help lactate. Okay. Our final two objectives are just to talk about burns and skin cancer very briefly. So burns are typically where we have injury from heat or live fire to the epidermis and sometimes the underlying dermis. There are 3 degrees to burns. There's first degree, second degree, third degree. First degree and second degree are much milder, typically only the upper part of the dermis and maybe even a part of the only the upper part of the epidermis, or sometimes the upper part of the dermis in the case of second degree. is injured in these cases, right? This is much milder. Typically, there's some type of scarring involved, but the skin will usually heal with little to no issues. Third-degree burns are significantly more dangerous and more difficult to heal. They consume the entire thickness of the skin. So you really injure or damage not only the epidermis, the full thickness of the epidermis, but you injure the full thickness of the dermis as well. And I mentioned earlier, it's very difficult to regenerate or to heal or to repair the epidermis layer if you don't have the dermis. So the burning or the damaging of all the layers of the skin really makes it difficult to heal. So in this image at the bottom, you can see that this burned all the way down. You can see the fatty layer, which is the hypodermis beneath. You can see the blood vessels beneath, some of the nerves beneath. And this is a full thickness burn or a third-degree burn. Okay, these are, again, very difficult to heal. They can become fatal because you lose water. So the skin, we mentioned, is a protective measure. It helps you to preserve heat, preserve water. But if you lose the full thickness of the skin, water will literally just evaporate from the surface of that open wound, and you can just become dehydrated, and that's how burns can become fatal, right? That third-degree burn. Okay. Now, we're not going to go into the details of the rules of 9, but I'll talk just about what it is. And this is the way we estimate how badly a patient has been burned. We talk about what extent of the arms, the legs, how much of the stomach has been burned. And this gives us an idea of categorizing whether it's a first, second, or third-degree burn. Okay, I'm sure those of you who are in the nursing program, who are in other health programs, will go through the details of that rule of 9s. And the last thing we're going to talk about is skin cancer. Again, a very clinical topic, so you're not going to be expected to know too much detail here, but we'll introduce these 3 types of skin cancer, and we'll relate some of the cells that are affected as a result of these carcinomas. So cancer, just to talk about how these cells are affected, is an abnormal growth. That's what cancer is. You have cells that either rapidly divide or incorrectly divide or spread and interact with other cells and so on and so forth. So basal cell carcinoma is the first kind of skin cancer we'll talk about. It's seen in this first image, A. It's typically found on the nose, parts of the face, and it's a very mild, benignant, benign form of cancer, all right? Usually associated with sun exposure, usually associated with older individuals who have lived long lives of sun exposure. So sailors typically may be exposed to basal cell carcinoma. And again, the areas of the face where you typically have the sun hitting you very often. The second type of cancer, squamous cell carcinoma, this arises from keratinocytes. And this is specifically in the stratum spinosum, which is that second layer we looked at, that very thick layer. And here we see a much more aggressive form of cancer. When I say aggressive, I mean it's going to spread easier. It's going to be more uncontrollable in the rate that these cells are multiplying and dividing. And so squamous cell carcinoma is a much more malignant form of cancer, also usually found on areas of the face and the trunk where you have sun exposure. Finally, melanoma is the most malignant type of skin cancer. It's typically associated with wounds or scars on the skin that are melanated or pigmented, which will indicate to you that it's a cancer of the melanocytes. It's the most dangerous form. It's the most aggressive form. Typically spreads to the brain and the lungs almost instantaneously. So usually by the time a patient is diagnosed with melanoma, they already have secondary cancers, usually again in the brain and in the lungs is where this cancer spreads to first. Okay, and again, this is a cancer of the melanocytes, and so they're going to rapidly start dividing, which is rapidly going to produce more pigment in that area, and you can see this dark mark, which is evident of a melanoma.